Good morning. Welcome back to the book that changed my life. A New Earth, Awakening to Your Life's Purpose. Chapter 4. Role Playing. By Eckharte Tolle. Role Playing. The Many Faces of Ego. An ego that wants something from another, and what ego doesn't, will usually play some kind of role to get its needs met. Be they material gain, a sense of power, superiority, or specialness, or some kind of gratification, be it physical or psychological. Usually, people are completely unaware of the roles they play. They are those roles. Some roles are subtle. Others are blatantly obvious, except to the person playing it. Some roles are designed simply to get attention from others. The ego thrives on others' attention, which is, after all, a form of psychic energy, or physic. I think it's psychic. The ego does not know that the source of all energy is within you, so it seeks it outside. It is not the formless attention, which is presence, that the ego seeks, but attention in some form, such as recognition, praise, admiration, or just to be noticed in some way, to have its existence acknowledged. A shy person who is afraid of the attention of others is not free of ego, but has an ambivalent ego that both wants and fears attention from others. The fear is that the attention may take the form of disapproval or criticism. That is to say, something that diminishes the sense of self rather than enhances it. So the shy person's fear of attention is greater than his or her need of attention. Shyness often goes with a self-concept that is predominantly negative, the belief of being inadequate. Any conceptual sense of self, seeing myself as this or that, is ego. Whether predominantly positive, I am the greatest, or negative, I am no good. Behind every positive self-concept is the hidden fear of not being good enough. Behind every negative self-concept is the hidden desire of being the greatest or better than others. Behind the confident ego's feeling of and continuing need for superiority is the unconscious fear of inferiority. Conversely, the shy, inadequate ego that feels inferior has a strong hidden desire for superiority. Many people fluctuate between feelings of inferiority and superiority depending on situations or the people they come into contact with. All you need to know and observe in yourself is this. Whenever you feel superior or inferior to anyone, that's the ego in you. Villain, victim, lover. Some egos, if they cannot get praise or admiration, will settle for other forms of attention and play roles to elicit them. If they cannot get positive attention, they may seek negative attention instead. For example, by provoking a negative reaction in someone else. Some children already do that too. They misbehave to get attention. The playing of negative roles becomes particularly pronounced whenever the ego is magnified by an active pain body. That is to say, emotional pain from the past that wants to renew itself through experiencing more pain. Some egos perpetrate crimes in their search for fame. They seek attention through notoriety and other people's condemnation. Please tell me that I exist, that I'm not insignificant, they seem to say. Such pathological forms of ego are only more extreme versions of normal egos. A very common role is the one of victim, and the form of attention it seeks is sympathy or pity or others' interest in my problems, me, my story. Seeing oneself as a victim is an element in many egoic patterns, such as complaining, being offended, outraged, and so on. Of course, once I am identified with the story in which I assigned myself the role of victim, I don't want it to end. And so every therapist knows the ego does not want an end to its problems because they are part of its identity. If no one will listen to my sad story, I can tell it to myself in my head over and over and feel sorry for myself, and so have an identity as someone who is being treated unfairly by life or other people, fate, or God. It gives definition to my self-image, makes me into someone that is all that matters to the ego. In the early stages of so-called romantic relationships, role-playing is quite common in order to attract and keep whoever is perceived by the ego as the one who is going to make me happy and make me feel special, and fulfill all of my needs. I'll play who you want me to be, and you'll play who I want you to be. That's the unspoken and conscious agreement. However, role-playing is hard work, and so those roles cannot be sustained indefinitely, especially once you start living together. When those roles slip, what do you see? Unfortunately, in most cases, not yet the true essence of that being, but that which covers up the true essence, the raw ego divested of its roles with its pain body and its thwarted wanting to now turns into anger, most likely directed at the spouse or partner for having failed to remove the underlying fear and sense of lack that is an intrinsic part of the egoic sense of self. What is commonly called falling in love is in most cases an intensification of egoic wanting and needing. You become addicted to another person, or rather to your image of that person. It has nothing to do with their true love, which contains no wanting whatsoever. The Spanish language is the most honest in regard to conventional notions of love. The quiero means I want you, as well as I love you. The other expression for I love you, te amo, which does not have this ambiguity, is rarely used, perhaps because true love is just as rare. Letting go of self-definitions. As tribal cultures develop into the ancient civilizations, certain functions began to be allotted to certain people. Ruler, priest, priestess, warrior, farmer, merchant, craftsman, laborer, and so on. A class system developed. Your function, which is in most cases you were born into, determined your identity, determined who you were in the eyes of others, as well as in your own eyes. Your function became a role, but it wasn't recognized as a role. It was who you were or thought you were. Only rare beings at the time, such as Buddha or Jesus, saw the ultimate irrelevance of casting or social class, recognized it as identification with form, and saw that such identification with the conditioned and the temporal obscured the light of the unconditioned and eternal that shines in each human being. Love you, Keith. In our contemporary world, the social structures are less rigid, less clearly defined than they used to be. Although most people are, of course, still conditioned by their environment, they are no longer automatically assigned a function and with it an identity. In fact, in the modern world, more and more people are confused as to where they fit in, what their purpose is, and even who they are. Woo! The memories. I usually congratulate people when they tell me, I don't know who I am anymore. Then they look perplexed and ask, Are you saying it's a good thing to be confused? I asked them to investigate. What does it mean to be confused? I don't know. Is not confusion. Confusion is, I don't know, but I should know. Or I don't know, but I need to know. Is it possible to let go of the belief that you should know or need to know who you are? In other words, can you cease looking to conceptual definitions to give you a sense of self? Can you cease looking to thought for an identity? When you let go of the belief that you should or need to know who you are, what happens to confusion? Suddenly it's gone. Whenever you fully accept that you don't know, you actually enter a state of peace and clarity that is closer to who you truly are than thought could ever be. Than thought could ever be. Defining yourself through thought is limiting yourself. Pre-established roles. Of course, different people fulfill different functions in this world. It cannot be otherwise. As far as intellectual or physical abilities are concerned, knowledge, skills, talents, and energy levels, human beings differ widely. What really matters is not what function you fulfill in this world, but whether you identify with your function to such an extent that it takes you over and becomes a role that you play. When you play roles, you are unconscious. When you catch yourself playing a role, that recognition creates a space between you and the role. It's funny because I listened to something this morning, I forgot her name, but it was an Audible, and she was saying when you're facing like your negative self, give it a name. Give it a name, and you can talk to it every time you have these negative thoughts. And one of them was like, Oliver, there you are again. And you talk yourself into that, okay, this is not me, but this is just a thought, you know? When you are completely identified with the role, you confuse a pattern of behavior with who you are, and you take yourself very seriously. You also automatically assign roles to others that correspond to yours. For example, when you visit doctors who are totally identified with their role, to them you will not be a human being, but a patient or a case history. Although the social structures in the contemporary world are less rigid than in ancient cultures, there are still many pre-established functions or roles that people readily identify with and which thus become part of the ego. This causes human interactions to become inauthentic, dehumanized, alienating. Those pre-established roles may give you a somewhat comforting sense of identity, but ultimately, you lose yourself in them. The functions people have in hierarchical organizations, such as the military, the church, a government institution, or large corporation, easily lend themselves to becoming role identities. Authentic human interactions become impossible when you lose yourself in a role. Some pre-established roles we could call archetypes. To mention just a few, the middle-class housewife, not as prevalent as it used to be, but still widespread. The tough macho male, the female seductress, the non-conformist artist or performer, a person of culture, a role quite common in Europe, who displays a knowledge of literature, fine art, and music in the same way as others might display an expensive dress or car. And then there is the universal role of adult. When you play that role, you take yourself in life very seriously. Spontaneity, lightheartedness, and joy are not part of that role. The hippie movement that originated on the west coast of the United States in the 1960s and then spread throughout the Western world came out of many young people's rejection of social archetypes, of roles, of pre-established patterns of behaviors, as well as egoically based social and economic structures. They refused to play the roles their parents and society wanted to impose on them. Significantly, it coincided with horrors of the Vietnam War, in which more than 57,000 young Americans and 3 million Vietnamese died, in which the insanity of the system and the underlying mindset was exposed for all to see. Whereas in the 1950s, most Americans were extremely conformist in thought and behavior. In the 1960s, millions of people began to withdraw their identification with the collective conceptual identity because the insanity of the collective was so obvious. The hippie movement represented a loosening of the hitherto rigid egoic structures in the psyche of humanity. The movement itself degenerated and came to an end, but it left behind an opening, and not just in whose were a part of the movement, in those who were a part of the movement. This made it possible for ancient Eastern wisdom and spirituality to move west and play an essential part in the awakening of global consciousness. Temporary roles. If you are awake enough, aware enough, to be able to observe how you interact with other people, you may detect subtle changes in your speech, attitude, and behavior depending on the person you are interacting with. At first, it may be easier to observe this in others. Then, you may also detect it in yourself. The way in which you, something that's on my mind, like, for example, when you're watching a video and they're like, and their eyes get big and your eyes get big. That's what I was just thinking about. At first, it may be easier to observe this in others, then you may detect it in yourself. The way in which you speak to the chairman of the company may be different in subtle ways from how you speak to the janitor. How you speak to a child may be different from how you speak to an adult. Why is that? You're playing roles. You are not yourself, neither with the chairman, nor with the janitor or the child. I am definitely a role player. When you walk into a store to buy something, when you go to a restaurant, the bank, the post office, you may find yourself slipping into pre-established social roles. I actually had my boss tell me that one time at work, because I worked in many different parts of the hotel. I did hostess, and then I did serving, and then I did in-room dining, and then I did coffee bar. I worked in the bar, and he was telling me, like, be yourself. And I'm just like, I didn't know who myself was at this time. It's just like, be yourself. Like, he was like when I'm working, I would just be like so proper and feel like I'm doing the Marriott way, you know, like from what I studied. And he's just like, just be you. So it's just funny. Where are we? When you walk into a store to buy something, when you go into a restaurant, the bank, the post office, you may find yourself slipping into pre-established social roles. You become a customer and speak and act as such. You may be treated by the salesperson or waiter, who is also playing a role, as a customer. A range of conditioned patterns of behavior come into effect between two human beings that determine the nature of the interaction. Instead of human beings, conceptual mental images are interacting with each other. The more identified people are with their respective roles, the more inauthentic the relationship becomes, or relationships become. You have a mental image not only of who the other person is, but also of who you are, especially in relation to the person you are interacting with. So you are not relating with that person at all, but who you think you are is relating to who you think the other person is, and vice versa. The conceptual image your mind has made of yourself is relating to its own creation, which is the conceptual image it has made of the other person. The other person's mind has probably done the same. So very egoic interaction between two people is in reality the interaction between for conceptual mind-made identities that are ultimately fictions. It is therefore not surprising there is so much conflict in relationships. There is no true relationship. The monk with sweaty palms. Kassan, a Zen teacher and monk, was to officiate at the funeral of a famous nobleman. As he stood there waiting for the governor to province and other lords and ladies to arrive, he noticed that the palms of his hands were sweaty. The next day he called his disciples together and confessed he was not yet ready to be a true teacher. He explained to them that he still lacked the sameness of bearing before all human beings, whether beggar or king. He was still unable to look through social roles and conceptual identities and see the sameness of being in every human. He then left and became the pupil of another master. He returned to his former disciples 8 years later, enlightened. Oh Lord, I hope it don't take y'all 8 years. I hope not. We in 2020, we speeding it up, baby. But if it takes you that long, there's nothing wrong. We love you. You love you. Amen. Happiness as a role versus true happiness. How are you? Just great. Couldn't be better. True or false? In many cases, happiness is a role people play, and behind the smiling facade, there is a great deal of pain. Depression, breakdowns, and overreactions are common when unhappiness is covered up behind a smiling exterior and brilliant white teeth. When there is denial, sometimes even to oneself, that there is much unhappiness. Just fine is a role the ego plays more commonly in America than in certain other countries, where being able and looking miserable. Just fine is a role the ego plays more commonly in America than in certain other countries, where being and looking miserable is almost the norm and therefore more socially acceptable. It is probably an exaggeration, but I'm told that in the capital of one Nordic country, you run the risk of being arrested for drunken behavior if you smile at strangers in the street. What? If there is, I'm not going there. Because I smile everywhere. People hate me for it. If there is unhappiness in you, first, you need to acknowledge that it is there. Acknowledge is step one. But don't say, I'm unhappy. Unhappiness has nothing to do with who you are. Say, there is unhappiness in me. Then investigate it. A situation you find yourself in may have something to do with it. Action may be required to change the situation or remove yourself from it. Change is healing. If there is nothing you can do, face what is and say, well, right now, this is how it is. I can either accept it or make myself miserable. Acceptance is peace. The primary cause of unhappiness is never the situation, but your thoughts about it. The primary cause of unhappiness is never the situation, but your thoughts about it. I gotta write that down. Be aware of the thoughts you are thinking. Separate them from the situation, which is always neutral, which is always is as it is. There is a situation, hold on, I'm just going to take a picture of that really quick so I don't forget. There is the situation or the fact, and here are my thoughts about it. Instead of making up stories, stay with the facts. For example, I am ruined is a story. It limits you and prevents you from taking effective action. I have 50 cents left in my bank account. is a fact. Facing facts is always empowering. Be aware. Oh my God. Be aware that what you think, to a large extent, creates the emotions that you feel. See the link between your thinking and your emotions. Rather than being your thoughts and emotions, be the awareness behind them. Don't seek happiness. If you seek it, you won't find it, because seeking is the antithesis of happiness. Antithesis of happiness. Got it? Happiness is ever elusive, but freedom from unhappiness is attainable now by facing what is rather than making up stories, by facing what is rather than making up stories about it. Unhappiness covers up your natural state of being and inner peace, the source of true happiness. Parenthood, role or function. Many adults play roles when they speak to young children. They use silly words and sounds. They talk down to the child. They don't treat the child as an equal. The fact that you temporarily know more or that you are bigger doesn't mean the child is not your equal. The majority of adults, at some point in their lives, find themselves being a parent, one of the most universal roles. The all-important question is, are you able to fulfill the function of being a parent and fulfill it well? Without identifying with that function, that is, without it becoming a role. Part of the necessary function of being a parent is looking after the needs of the child, preventing the child from getting into danger, and at times telling the child what to do and not to do. When being a parent becomes an identity, however, when your sense of self is entirely or largely derived from it, the function easily becomes overemphasized, exaggerated, and takes you over. I think this is why a lot of people, they find happiness after they have children, or they think they do. But they do change, or they find ego, or they understand it, whatever it may be. It always happens that way. Giving children what they need becomes excessive and turns into spoiling. Preventing them from getting into danger becomes overprotectiveness and interferes with their need to explore the world and try things out for themselves. Telling children what to do or not to do becomes controlling, overbearing. What is more, the role-playing identity remains in place long after the need. Okay, what is more, the role-playing identity remains in place long after the need for those particular functions has passed. Parents then cannot let go of being a parent even when the child grows into an adult. They can't let go of the need to be needed by their child. Even when the adult child is 40 years old, parents can't let go of the notion, I know what's best for you. The role of the parent is still being played compulsively, and so there is no authentic relationship. Parents define themselves by that role and are unconsciously afraid of loss of identity when they cease being parents. If their desire to control or influence the actions of their adult child is thwarted, as it usually is, they will start to criticize or show their disapproval or try to make their child feel guilty, all in an unconscious attempt to preserve their role, their identity. On the surface, it looks as if they were concerned about their child, and they themselves believe it, but they are only really concerned about preserving their role identity. All egoic motivations are self-enhancement and self-interest, sometimes cleverly disguised, even from the person in whom the ego operates. A mother or father who identifies with the parental role may also try to become more complete through their children. The ego's need to manipulate others into filling the sense of lack it continuously feels is then directed towards them. If the mostly unconscious assumptions and motivations behind the parent's compulsion to manipulate their child were made conscious and voiced, they would probably include some or all of the following. I want you to achieve what I never achieved. I want you to be somebody in the eyes of the world so that I too can be somebody through you. Don't disappoint me. I sacrifice so much for you. My disapproval of you is intended to make you feel so guilty and uncomfortable that you finally conform to my wishes. And it goes without saying that I know what's best for you. I love you and I will continue to love you if you do what I know is right for you. When you make such unconscious motivations conscious, you immediately see how absurd they are. The ego that lies behind them becomes visible, as does its dysfunction. Some parents that I spoke to suddenly realized, my God, is this what I've been doing? Once you see what you are doing or have been doing, you also see its futility. And that unconscious pattern then comes to an end by itself. Awareness is the greatest agent for change. Black Lives Matter. If your parents are doing this to you, you do not tell them they are unconscious and in the grip of ego. That will likely make them even more unconscious because the ego will take up a defensive portion. It is enough for you to recognize that it is the ego in them, that it is not who they are. Everything's temporary. Egoic patterns, even long-standing ones, sometimes dissolve almost miraculously when you don't oppose them internally. Opposition only gives them renewed strength. But even if they don't, you can then accept your parents' behavior with compassion, without needing to react to it. That is to say, without personalizing it. Be aware also of your own unconscious assumptions or expectations that lie behind your old habitual reactions to them. My parents should approve of what I do. They should understand me and accept me for who I am. Really? Why should they? The fact is, they don't because they can't. Their evolving consciousness hasn't made the quantum leap to the level of awareness yet. They are not yet able to disidentify from their role. Yes, but I can't feel happy and comfortable with who I am unless I have their approval and understanding. Really? What difference does their approval or disapproval truly make to who you are? All such unexamined assumptions cause a great deal of negative emotion, much unnecessary unhappiness. Be alert. Are some of the thoughts that go through your mind the internalized voice of your father or mother saying perhaps something like, you are not good enough, you will never amount to anything, or some other judgment or mental position? If there is awareness in you, you will be able to recognize that voice inside of your head for what it is, an old thought, conditioned by the past. If there is awareness in you, you no longer need to believe in every thought you think. It's an old thought, no more. Awareness means presence, and only presence can dissolve the unconsciousness past in you. If you think you are so enlightened, Ram Dass said, go ahead and spend a week with your parents. That is good advice. The relationship with your parents is not only the primordial relationship that sets the tone for all not only the primordial relationship that sets the tone for all subsequent relationships. It is also a good test for your degree of presence. Woo! I needed that one. The more shared past there is in a relationship, the more present you need to be. Otherwise, you will be forced to relive the past again and again. Conscious suffering. If you have young children, give them help, guidance, and protection to the best of your ability. But even more important, give them space to be. They come into this world through you, but they are not yours. The belief I know what's best for you may be true when they're very young, but the older they get, the less true it becomes. The more expectations you have of how their life should unfold, the more you are in your mind instead of being present for them. Eventually, they will make mistakes, and they will experience some form of suffering, as all humans do. In fact, they may be mistakes only from your perspective. In fact, they may be mistakes only from your perspective. What to you is a mistake may be exactly what your children needed to do or experience. Give them as much help and guidance as you can, but realize that you may also at times have to allow them to make mistakes, especially as they begin to reach adulthood. At times, you may also have to allow them to suffer. Suffering may come to them out of the blue, or it may come as a consequence of their own mistakes. Wouldn't it be wonderful if you could spare them from all suffering? No, it wouldn't. They would not evolve as human beings and would remain shallow, identified with the external forms of things. Suffering drives you deeper. The paradox is that suffering is caused by identification with form and erodes identification with form. A lot of it is caused by the ego, although eventually suffering destroys the ego, but not until you suffer consciously. Humanity is destined to go beyond suffering, but not in the way the ego thinks. One of the ego's many erroneous assumptions, one of its many diluted thoughts is, I should not have to suffer. Sometimes the thought gets transferred to someone close to you. My child should not have to suffer. That thought itself lies at the root of suffering. Suffering has a noble purpose, the evolution of consciousness and the burning up of ego. The man on the cross is an archetypal image. He is every man and every woman. As long as you resist suffering, it is a slow process because the resistance creates more ego to burn up. When you accept suffering, however, there is an acceleration of that process which is brought about by the fact that you suffer consciously. You can accept suffering for yourself, or you can accept it for someone else, such as your child or parent. In the midst of conscious suffering, there is already the transmutation. The fire of suffering becomes the light of consciousness. The ego says, I shouldn't have to suffer. And that thought makes you suffer so much more. It is a distortion of the truth, which is always paradoxical. The truth is that you need to say yes to suffering before you can transcend it. Woo! Testimony time? Maybe yes or no. My suffering when I guess, became conscious was with a breakup. My first true love, which apparently was with a woman or a girl, and I couldn't understand it. Like, I thought we were perfect. We thought we were perfect. We couldn't connect. We did connect. We have so much fun together. We still enjoy each other, but we're not together, and it was a chapter, you know? You're very welcome, Franco, and more to come, more to come, more to come, okay? I love you, and thank you so much for speaking up and letting me know. So yeah, my awakening was through a breakup, and I didn't understand. I worked out, I sang, I danced, everything that I knew. I read the Bible, I read hundreds of Bible books, and for some reason, I couldn't get the concept of the ego or awakening or accepting suffering. I always tried not to suffer. I always tried to help my friends not to suffer. Lord, I have come a long way. But yeah, so for mine, it was definitely the breakup of my first true love, apparently. Or whatever it was what it is, or was. Conscious parenting. Well, I'll speak a little bit more. So my cousin, I reached out to my cousin because I didn't know where to go. I couldn't find any help, and she's Dominican, and I didn't really ever know her growing up. I knew her a little bit older when I asked to stay the night because I went to Miami and they never met him. And I stayed connected with her, and then when I had this problem, she was just like, "It's okay, you're fine." She was like, "Do you beat up a baby when it walks? Do you yell at him and tell him that he's a shit?" I'm like, "No." "Okay, then why are you doing that to yourself?" I'm like, "Because that's what we do." And then she gave me the book, The Kabbalion. I read that first, and then I read this, and I read more after that, and I'm going to read them to you. Conscious parenting. Many children harbor hidden anger and resentment toward their parents, and often the cause is inauthenticity in the relationship. The child has a deep longing for the parent to be there as a human being, not as a role, no matter how conscientiously that role is being, it looks like science, consciously, okay, that the role is being played. You may be doing all the right things and the best you can do for your child, but even doing the best you can is not enough. In fact, doing is never enough if you neglect being. In fact, doing is never enough if you neglect being here right now. The ego knows nothing of being, but believes you will eventually be saved by doing. If you are in the grip of ego, you believe that doing more and more will eventually accumulate enough doings to make yourself feel complete at some point in the future. You won't, and you will only lose yourself in doing. The entire civilization is losing itself in doing that is not rooted in being, and thus becomes futile. Been there. I literally did everything that I could to stop thinking, and I didn't know that I just had to be present. I had so many jobs. I do it. Like, you'd think I'm multi-talented. Like, I just keep myself busy, and I just learn all these things. I was trying to figure out what was wrong. Or not trying to figure out what was wrong and just stay busy. How do you bring being into the life of a busy family, into the relationship with your child? How do you bring being into the life of a busy family into the relationship with your child? The key is to give your child attention. Time is love is more powerful than any man-made medicine. There are two kinds of attention. One we might call form-based attention. The other is formless attention. Form-based attention is always connected in some way with doing or evaluating. Have you done your homework? Eat your dinner. Tidy up your room. Brush your teeth. Do this. Stop doing that. Hurry up. Get ready. What's the next thing we have to do? This question pretty much summarizes what family life is like in many homes. Form-based attention is, of course, necessary and has its place. But if that's all there is in the relationship with your child, then the most vital dimension is missing, and being becomes completely obscured by doing, by the cares of the world, as Jesus puts it. Formless attention is inseparable from the dimension of being. How does it work? As you look at, listen to, touch, or help your child with this or that, you are alert, still completely present, not wanting anything other than that moment as it is. In this way, you make room for being. In that moment, if you are present, you are not a father or a mother. You are the alertness, the stillness, the presence that is listening, looking, touching, even speaking. You are the being behind the doing. recognizing your child. You are a human being. What does that mean? Mastery of life is not a question or control, but of finding a balance between human and being. Mother, father, husband, wife, young, old, the roles you play, the functions you fulfill, whatever you do, all that belongs to the human dimension. It has its place and needs to be honored, but in itself it is not enough for a fulfilled, truly meaningful relationship or life. Human alone is never enough, no matter how hard you try or what you achieve. Then there is being. It is found in the still, alert presence of consciousness itself, the consciousness that you are. Human is form. Being is formlessness. Human and being are not separate, but interwoven. In the human dimension, you are unquestionably superior to your child. You are bigger, stronger, know more, you can do more. If that dimension is all you know, you will feel superior to your child, if only unconsciously. And you will be able to make your child feel inferior, if only unconsciously. There is no equality between you and your child because there's only form in your relationship, and in form, you are, of course, not equal. You may love your child, but your love will be human only. That is to say, conditional, possessive, intermittent. Only beyond form, in being, you are equal. And only when you find the formlessness dimension in yourself can there be a true love in that relationship. The presence that you are, the timeless I am, recognizes itself in another and the other. The child, in this case, feels loved, that is to say, recognized. To love is to recognize yourself in another. The other's otherness. Hold on, I gotta say that again. To love is to recognize yourself in another, no matter what color, no matter what ethnicity, no matter what language you speak. The other's otherness then stands revealed as an illusion pertaining to the purely human realm, the realm of form. The longing for love that is in every child is the longing to be recognized, not on the level of form, but on the level of being. If parents honor only the human dimension of the child but neglect being, the child will sense that the relationship is unfulfilled, that something absolutely vital is missing, and there will be a buildup of pain in the child and sometimes unconsciousness, resentment towards the parents. Why don't you recognize me? That is the pain or the resentment that seems to be saying. That is what the pain or resentment seems to be saying. When another recognizes you, that recognition draws the dimension of being more fully into this world through both of you. That is the love that redeems the world. I have been speaking of this with specific references to the relationship with your child, but it equally applies, of course, to all relationships. It has been said, God is love. That's where I got it from. But that is not absolutely correct. God is the one life in and beyond the countless forms of life. Love implies duality. Lover and the loved, subject and object. So love is the recognition of oneness in the world of duality. This is the birth of God into the world of form. Love makes the world less worldly, less dense, more transparent to the divine dimension, the light of consciousness itself. Giving up role playing. To do whatever is required of you in any situation without it becoming a role that you identify with is an essential lesson in the art of living that each one of us is here to learn. You become most powerful in whatever you do if the action is performed for its own sake rather than as a means to protect, enhance, or conform to your role identity. Every role is a fictitious sense of self, and through it everything becomes personalized and thus corrupted and distorted by the mind-made little me in whatever role it happens to be playing. Most of the people who are in positions of power in this world, such as politicians, TV personalities, business as well as religious leaders, are completely identified with their role, with a few notable exceptions. They may be considered VIPs, but they are no more than unconscious players in the egoic game, a game that looks so important yet is ultimately devoid of true purpose. It is, in the words of Shakespeare, a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Amazingly, Shakespeare arrived at this conclusion without having the benefit of television. If the egoic earth drama has any purpose at all, it is an indirect one. It creates more and more suffering on the planet, and suffering, although largely ego-created, is in the end also ego-destructive. It is the fire in which the ego burns itself up. In a world of role-playing personalities, those few people who don't project the mind-made image, and there are some even on TV, in the media, and the business world, but function from a deeper core of their being, those who do not attempt to appear more than they are but simply themselves stand out as remarkable, and are the only ones who truly make a difference in this world. They are the bringers of the new consciousness. Whatever they do becomes empowered because it is in alignment with the purpose of the whole. Their influence, however, goes far beyond what they do, far beyond their function. Their mere presence, simple, natural, unassuming, has a transformational effect on whoever they come in contact with. When you don't play roles, it means there is no self, ego, in what you do. There is no secondary agenda, protection, or strengthening of yourself. As a result, your actions have far greater power. You are totally focused on the situation. You become one with it. You don't try to be anybody in particular. You are most powerful, most effective when you are completely yourself. But don't try to be yourself. That's another role. It's called natural, spontaneous me. As soon as you're trying to be this or that, you are playing a role. Just be yourself is good advice, but it can be misleading. The mind will come in and say, let's see how I can be myself. Then the mind will develop some kind of strategy, how to be myself, another role. How can I be myself is, in fact, the wrong question. It implies you have to do something to be yourself. But how doesn't apply here because you are yourself already. Just stop adding unnecessary baggage to who you are, to who you already are. But I don't know who I am. I don't know what it means to be myself. If you can be absolutely comfortable with not knowing who you are, then what's left is who you are. The being behind the human, a field of pure potentiality rather than something that is already defined. Give up defining yourself, to yourself or to others. You won't die, you will come to life. And don't be concerned with how others define you. When they define you, they are limiting themselves, so it's their problem. Whenever you interact with people, don't be there primarily as a function or a role, but as a field of conscious presence. Why does the ego play roles? Because one of the unexamined assumption, one fundamental error, one unconscious thought. That thought is, I am not enough. Other unconscious thoughts follow. I need to play a role in order to get what I need to be fully myself. I need to get more so that I can be more. But you cannot be more than you are, because underneath your physical and psychological form, you are one with life itself, one with being. In form, you are and will always be inferior to some, superior to others. In essence, you are neither inferior nor superior to anyone. True self-esteem and true humility arises out of that realization. In the eyes of the ego, self-esteem and humility are contradictory. In truth, they are one and the same. The pathological ego. In a wider sense of the word, the ego itself is pathological, no matter what form it takes. When we look at the ancient Greek root of the word pathological, we discover just how appropriate that term is when applied to the ego. Although the word is not normally used to describe a condition of disease, it is derived from pathos, which means suffering. This is, of course, exactly what the Buddha already discovered 2,600 years ago as a characteristic of the human condition. A person in the grip of ego, however, does not recognize suffering as suffering, but will look upon it as the only appropriate response in any given situation. The ego, in its blindness, is incapable of seeing the suffering it inflicts on itself and onto others. Unhappiness is an ego-created mental emotional disease that has reached epidemic proportions. It is the inner equivalent of the environmental pollution of our planet. Negative states such as anger, anxiety, hatred, resentment, discontent, envy, jealousy, and so on are not recognized as negative, but as totally justified, and are further misperceived not as self-created, but as caused by someone else or some external factor. I am holding you responsible for my pain. This is what, by implication, the ego is saying. The ego cannot distinguish between a situation and its interpretation of reaction to that situation. You might say, "What a dreadful day," without realizing that the cold, the wind, and the rain, or whatever condition you react to, are not dreadful. They are as they are. What is dreadful is your reaction, your inner resistance to it, and the emotion that is created by that resistance. In Shakespeare's words, there is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. What is more, suffering or negativity is often perceived by the ego as it. What is more, suffering or negativity is often perceived by the ego as pleasure, because up to a point, the ego strengthens itself through it. So the food of ego is negativity. For example, just like the food of viruses or bacteria is sugar. For example, the anger or resentment, gluten and dairy, too. For example, the anger and resentment strengthen the ego enormously by increasing the sense of separateness, emphasizing the otherness of others, and creating a seemingly unassailable fortress-like mental position of rightness. If you were able to observe the psychological changes that take place inside of your body when possessed by such negative states, how they adversely affect the functioning of the heart, the digestive and immune systems, and countless other bodily functions, it would become abundantly clear that such states are indeed pathological, are forms of suffering and not pleasurable. It's true, and it's proven. And it weakens your immune system when you have these thoughts, and that's how the virus and the bacteria get stronger, on top of the food that you give them. Whenever you are in a negative state, there is something in you that wants the negativity, that perceives it as a pleasurable, or that believes it will get you what you want. Otherwise, who would want to hang on to negativity, make themselves and others miserable, and create disease in the body? So whenever there is negativity in you, you can be aware at the moment that there is something in you that takes pleasure in it or believes it has a useful purpose. You are becoming aware of the ego directly. The moment this happens, your identity has shifted from ego to awareness. This means the ego is shrinking and awareness is growing. If in the midst of negativity, you are able to realize, at this moment I am creating suffering for myself, it will be enough to raise you above the limitations of conditioned egoic states and reactions. It will open up infinite possibilities which come to you when there is awareness, other vastly more intelligent ways of dealing with any situation. You will be free to let go of your unhappiness the moment you recognize it as unintelligent. Negativity is not intelligent. It is always of the ego. The ego may be clever, but it is not intelligent. Cleverness pursues its own little aims. Intelligence sees the larger whole in which all things are connected. Cleverness is motivated by self-interest, and it is extremely short-sighted. Most politicians and business people are clever. Very few are intelligent. Whatever is attained through cleverness is short-lived and always turns out to be eventually self-defeating. Cleverness divides. Intelligence includes. Okay, water break. The iPad's dying, I gotta get the charger. It was super close and I didn't even realize it, that I had it here with me. Okay. Yeah, I thought it was changing from my laptop. Definitely is not. All right, I'm back. The background unhappiness. The ego creates separation, and separation creates suffering. The ego is therefore clearly pathological. Apart from the obvious ones such as anger, hatred, and so on. Oh, shoot. Forgot the headphones. I'm going to read it again just in case it wasn't as loud as I wanted it to be. Okay. The background unhappiness. The ego creates separation, and separation creates suffering. The ego is therefore clearly pathological. Apart from obvious ones such as anger, hatred, and so on. There are other more subtle forms of negativity that are so common they are usually not recognized as such. For an example, impatience, irritation, nervousness, and being fed up. They constitute the background unhappiness that is many people's predominant inner state. You need to be extremely alert and absolutely present to be able to detect them. Whenever you do, it is a moment of awakening, of disidentification from the mind. Here's one of the most common negative states that is easily overlooked, precisely because it is so common, so normal. You may be familiar with it. Do you often experience a feeling of discontent that could be best described as a kind of background resentment? It may be either specific or non-specific. Many people spend a large part of their lives in that state. They are so identified with it that they cannot stand back and see it. Underlying that feeling are certain unconsciously held beliefs. That is to say, thoughts. You think these thoughts in the same way that you dream your dream when you're asleep. In other words, you don't know you are thinking those thoughts, just as the dreamer doesn't know he is dreaming. Here's some of the most common unconscious thoughts that feed the feeling of discontent or background resentment. I have stripped away the content from those thoughts so that the bare structure remains. They become more clearly visible that way. Wherever there is unhappiness in the background of your life, or even in the foreground, you can see which of these thoughts applies and fill in your own content according to your personal situation. There is something that needs to happen in my life before I can be at peace, happy, fulfilled, etc. And I resent that it hasn't happened yet. Maybe my resentment will finally make it happen. Something that happened in the past that should not have happened, and I resent that. If it hadn't happened, I would be at peace now. Something is happening now that should not be happening, and it is preventing me from being at peace now. Often, the unconscious beliefs are directed towards a person, and so happening becomes doing. You should do this or that so I can be at peace, and I resent that you haven't done it yet. Maybe my resentment will make you do it. Something you or I did, said, or failed to do in the past is preventing me from being at peace now. What are you doing or failing to do now? What you are doing or failing to do now is preventing me from being at peace. The secret of happiness. All of the above are assumptions, unexamined thoughts that are confused with reality. There are stories the ego creates to convince you that you cannot be at peace now or cannot be fully yourself now. Being at peace and being who you are, that is, being yourself, are one. The ego says, maybe at some point in the future I can be at peace. If this, that, or the other happens, or I obtain this, or become that. Or it says, I can never be at peace because of something that happened in the past. Listen to people's stories, and they could all be entitled, Why I Cannot Be at Peace Now. The ego doesn't know that your only opportunity for being at peace is now. Or maybe it doesn't know. And it is afraid that you may find this out. Peace, after all, is the end of the ego. How to be at peace now? By making peace with the present moment. The present moment is the field on which the game of life happens. It cannot happen anywhere else. Once you have made peace with the present moment and see what happens, you can do or choose to do, or rather what life does through you. There are 3 words that convey the secret of the art of living, the secret of all success and happiness. One with life. Being one with life is being one with now. One with life. So those are the 3 words. One with life. Being one with life is being one with now. Then you realize that you don't live your life, but life lives you. Life is the dancer, and you are the dance. The ego loves its, maybe that's why I love dancing. I don't know, everything is just beautiful. The ego loves its resentment of reality. What is reality? Whatever is. Buddha called it tathata, the suchness of life, which is no more than the suchness of this moment. Opposition toward that suchness is one of the main features of the ego. It creates the negativity and the ego thrives on it, then happiness that it loves. In this way, you make yourself and others suffer and don't even know that you're doing it. Don't know that you are creating hell on earth. Been there. To create suffering without recognizing it, this is the essence of unconscious living. This is being totally in the grip of the ego. The extent of the ego's inability to recognize itself and see what it is doing is staggering and unbelievable. It will do exactly what it condemns others for and not see it. When it is pointed out, it will use angry denial, clever arguments, and self-justifications to distort the facts. People do it. Corporations do it. Governments do it. When all else fails, the ego will resort to shouting or even to physical violence. Send in the Marines. We can now understand the deep wisdom in Jesus' words on the cross. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. The end, shout out to Lauryn Hill, to end the misery that has afflicted the human condition for thousands of years, you have to start with yourself and take responsibility for your inner state at any given moment. That means now, right now. Ask yourself, is there negativity in me at this moment? Then become alert, attentive to your thoughts as well as your emotions. Watch out for the low-level unhappiness in whatever form that I mentioned earlier, such as discontent, nervousness, being fed up, and so on. Watch out for thoughts that appear to justify or explain this unhappiness, but in reality cause it. The moment you become aware of a negative state within yourself does not mean you have failed. It means that you have succeeded. Until that awareness happens, there is identification with inner states, and such identification is ego. With awareness comes disidentification from thoughts, emotions, and reactions. This is not to be confused with denial. The thoughts, emotions, or reactions are recognized, and in the moment of recognizing, disidentification happens automatically. Your sense of self, of who you are, then undergoes a shift. Before, you were the thoughts, emotion, and reactions. Now you are the awareness, the conscious presence that witnesses those states. One day I will be free of ego. Who is talking? The ego. To become free of the ego is not really a big job, but a very small one. All you need to do is be aware of your thoughts and emotions as they happen. So spend time with yourself. This is not really a doing, but an alert seeing. In that sense, it is true that there is nothing you can do to become free of the ego. When that shift happens, which is the shift from thinking to awareness, an intelligence far greater than the ego's cleverness begins to operate in your life. Emotion and even thoughts become depersonalized through awareness. Their impersonal nature is recognized. There is no longer a self in them. They are just human emotions, human thoughts. Your entire personal history, which is ultimately no more than a story, a bundle of thoughts and emotions, becomes of secondary importance and no longer occupies the forefront of your consciousness. It no longer forms the basis for your sense of identity. You are the light of presence, the awareness that is prior to and deeper than any thoughts and emotions. Pathological forms of ego. As we have seen, the ego is in its essential nature pathological. If we use the word in its wider sense to denote dysfunction and suffering. As we have seen, the ego is in its essential nature pathological. So a disease in a sense, I guess. Or it can lead to a disease, actually. If we use the word in its wider sense to denote the dysfunction and suffering. Many mental disorders consist of the same egoic traits that operate in a normal person, except that they have become so pronounced that their pathological nature is now obvious to anyone except the sufferer. For example, many normal people tell certain kinds of lies from time to time in order to appear more important, more special, and to enhance their image in the mind of others, who they know what their achievements, abilities, and possessions are, and whatever else the ego uses to identify with. Some people, however, driven by the ego's feeling of insufficiency and its need to have or be more, lie habitually and compulsively. Most of what they tell you about themselves, their story, is a complete fantasy, a fictitious edifice the ego has designed for itself to be bigger, more special. Their grandiose and inflated self-image could sometimes fool others, but usually not for long. It is then quickly recognized by most people as a complete fiction. The mental illness that is called paranoid schizophrenia, or paranoia for short, is essentially an exaggerated form of ego. I knew it! It usually consists of a fictitious story the mind has invented to make sense of a persistent underlying feeling of fear. The main element of the story is the belief that certain people, sometimes large numbers or almost everyone, are plotting against me, are conspiring to control or kill me. The story often has an inner consistency and logic, so that sometimes fools others into believing it too. Sometimes organizations or entire nations have paranoid belief systems at their very basis. The ego's fear and distrust of the people, its tendency to emphasize the otherness of the others by focusing on the perceived faults and make those faults into their identity, is taken a little further and makes others into inhuman monsters. The ego needs others, but its dilemma is that deep down inside it hates and fears them. Jean-Paul Sartre's statement, "Hell is other people," is the voice of the ego. The person suffering from paranoia experiences that hell almost acutely, but everyone in whom the egoic pattern still operates will feel it to some degree. The stronger the ego in you, the more likely it is that in your perception, other people are the main source of problems in your life. It is also more than likely that you will make life difficult for others. But of course, you won't be able to see that. It is always others who seem to be doing it to you. The mental illness we call paranoia also manifests another symptom that is an element of every ego, although in paranoia it takes on a more extreme form. The more the sufferer sees himself persecuted, spied on, or threatened by others, the more pronounced becomes his sense of being the center of the universe around whom everything revolves. And the more special and more important he feels as the imagined focal point of so many people's attention. His sense of being a victim, of being wronged by so many people, makes him feel very special. In the story, that forms the basis of his delusional system. Often he assigns to himself the role of both victim and potential hero who's going to save the world or defeat the forces of evil. The collective ego tribes, nations, and religious organizations also frequently contain a strong element of paranoia. Us against the evil others. It is the cause of much human suffering. The Spanish Inquisition, the persecution and burning of heretics and witches, the relations between nations leading up to the First and Second World Wars, communism throughout its history, the Cold War, McCarthyism in America in the 1950s, prolonged violent conflict in the Middle East are all painful episodes in human history dominated by extreme collective paranoia. The more unconscious individuals, groups, or nations are, the more likely that it is that egoic pathology will assume the form of physical violence. Violence is primitive, but still in a very widespread way that which the ego attempts to assert itself, to prove itself right and another wrong. With very unconscious people, arguments can easily lead to physical violence. What is an argument? Two or more people express their opinions, and those opinions differ. Each person is so identified with the thoughts that make up their opinion that those thoughts harden into mental positions which are invested with a sense of self. In other words, identity and thought merge. Once this has happened, when I defend my opinions, thoughts, I feel and act as if I were defending my very self. Unconsciously, I feel and act as if I were fighting for survival, and so my emotions will reflect this unconscious belief. They become turbulent. I'm upset, angry, defensive, or aggressive. I need to win at all costs, lest I become annihilated. That's the illusion. The ego doesn't know that mind and mental positions have nothing to do with who you are, because the ego is the unobserved mind itself. In Zen, they say, don't seek the truth, just cease to cherish opinions. What does that mean? Let go of identification with your mind. Who you are beyond the mind then emerges by itself. Hi, Philip. Happy Monday. Work with and without ego. Most people have moments when they are free of ego. Those who are exceptionally good at what they do may be completely or largely free of ego while performing their work. They may not know it, but their work has become a spiritual practice. Most of them are present while they do their work and fall back into relative unconsciousness in their private life. This means their state of present is, for time being, confined to one area in their life. I have met teachers, artists, nurses, doctors, scientists, social workers, waiters, hairdressers, business owners, and salespeople who perform their work admirably without any self-seeking, fully responding to whatever the moment requires of them. They are one with what they do, one with the now, one with the people or the tasks they serve. The influence such people have upon others goes far beyond the function they perform. They bring about a lessening of the ego in everyone who comes into contact with them. Even people with heavy egos sometimes begin to relax, let their guard down, and stop playing their roles when they interact with them. It comes as no surprise that those people who work without ego are extraordinarily successful at what they do. Anybody who is one with what he or she does is building the new earth. So amazing, because in the meeting, a unity meeting that we had last night, we were talking about the new earth. Like, what are we doing to create the new earth better for our children? I have also met many others who may be technically good at what they do, but whose ego constantly sabotages their work. Only part of their attention is on the work they perform. The other part is on themselves. Their ego demands personal recognition and wastes energy in resentment if it doesn't get enough, and it's never enough. Is someone else getting more recognition than me? Or their main focus of attention is profit or power, and their work is no more than a means to that end? When work is no more than a means to an end, it cannot be of high quality. When obstacles or difficulties arise in their work, when things don't go according to expectation, when other people or circumstances are not helpful or cooperative, instead of immediately becoming one with the new situation and responding to the requirements of the present moment, they react against the situation and so separate themselves from it. There is a me that feels personally offended or resentful, and a huge amount of energy is burned up in useless protest or anger. Energy that could be used for solving the situation if it were not being misused by the ego. What is more, this anti-energy creates new obstacles, new opposition. Many people are truly their own worst enemy. People unknowingly sabotage their own work when they withhold help or information from others to try to undermine them, lest they become more successful or get more credit than me. Cooperation is alien to the ego, except when there is a secondary motive. The ego doesn't know that the more you include others, the more smoothly things flow and the more easily things come to you. When you give little or no help to others or put obstacles in their path, the universe, in the form of people or circumstances, gives little or no help to you because you have cut yourself off from the whole. The ego's unconscious core feelings of not enough cause it to react to someone else's success as if that success had taken something away from me. It doesn't know that your resentment of another person's success curtails your own chances of success. In order to attract success, you need to welcome it wherever you see it. The ego in illness. An illness can either strengthen or weaken the ego. If you complain, feel self-pity, or resent being ill, your ego becomes stronger. It also becomes stronger if you make the illness part of your conceptual identity. I am a sufferer of such and such a disease. If anybody knows me, you've seen this part of me. Oh, and so now we know who you are. Some people, on the other hand, who in normal life have a big ego, suddenly become gentle and kind and much nicer people when they are ill. They may gain insights they may have never had in their normal life. They may access their inner knowing and contentment and speak words of wisdom. Then, when they get better, energy returns and so does the ego. Please don't let that happen. When you are ill, your energy level is quite low, and the intelligence of the organ may take over and use the remaining energy for the healing of the body. So there's not enough left for the mind, that is to say, ego thinking and emotion. The ego burns up considerable amounts of energy. In some cases, however, the ego retains the little energy that remains and uses it for its own purposes. Needless to say, those people who experience a strengthening of the ego in illness take much longer to recover. Some never do, and so the illness becomes chronic and a permanent part of their false sense of self. Just grateful, amen, thank you that I came out. I was so sick, it was unbelievable. You can find it on my YouTube. I got the story there somewhere. The collective ego. How hard is it to live with yourself? One of the ways in which the ego attempts to escape the unsatisfactoriness of personal selfhood is to enlarge and strengthen its sense of self by identifying with the group, a nation, political party, corporation, institution, sect, club, gang, football team. In some cases, the personal ego seems to dissolve completely as someone dedicates his or her life to working selflessly for the greater good or the collective without demanding personal rewards, recognition, or aggrandizement. What a relief to be freed of the dreadful burden of personal self. The members of collective feel happy and fulfilled, no matter how hard they work, how many sacrifices they make. They appear to have gone beyond ego. The question is, have they truly become free, or has the ego simply shifted from the personal to the collective? A collective ego manifests the same characteristics as the personal ego, such as the need for conflict and enemies, the need for more, the need to be right against others who are wrong, and so on. Sooner or later, the collective will come into conflict with other collectives because it unconsciously seeks conflict and it needs opposition to define its boundary and thus its identity. Its members will then experience the suffering that inevitably comes in the wake of any ego-motivated action. At that point, they may wake up and realize that the collective has a strong element of insanity. It can be painful at first to suddenly wake up and realize that the collective you had identified with and worked for is actually insane. Some people at that point become cynical or bitter, and henceforth deny all values, all worth. This means that they quickly adopted another belief system when the previous one was recognized as illusory and therefore collapsed. They didn't face the depth of their ego, but ran away and reincarnated into a new one. A collective ego is usually more unconscious than the individuals that make up that ego. For example, crowds, which are temporarily collective egoic entities, are capable of committing atrocities that the individual away from the crowd would not be. Nations not infrequently engaged in behavior that would be immediately recognizable as psychopathic in an individual. Okay. The collective ego is usually more unconscious than the individual that makes up that ego. For example, the crowds, which temporarily collective egos entities, are capable of committing atrocities that the individual away from the crowd would not be. Nations not infrequently engaged in behavior that would be immediately recognizable as psychopathic and an individual. As the new consciousness emerge, some people will feel called upon to form groups that reflect the enlightened consciousness. These groups will not be collective egos. The individuals who make up these groups will have no need to define their identity through them. They no longer look to any form to define who they are. Even if the members that make up those groups are not totally free of ego yet, there will be enough awareness in them to recognize the ego in themselves or in others as soon as it appears. However, constant alertness is required since the ego will try to take over and reassert itself in any way it can. Dissolving the human ego by bringing it into the light of awareness. This will be one of the main purposes of these groups. Whether they be enlightened business, charitable organizations, schools, or communities of people living together. Enlightened collectives will fulfill an important function in the arising of the new consciousness. Just as egoic collectives pull you into consciousness and suffering, the enlightened collective can be a vortex for consciousness that will accelerate the planetary shift. Incontrovertible proof of immortality. Ego comes about through a split in the human psyche in which identity separates into two parts that we could call I and me, or me and myself. Every ego is therefore schizophrenic, to use the word in its popular meaning of split personality. You live with a mental image of yourself, a conceptual self that you have a relationship with. Life itself becomes conceptualized and separated from who you are when you speak of my life. The moment you say or think my life and believe it in what you are saying rather than it just being a linguistic convention, you have entered the realm of delusion. If there is such a thing as my life, it follows that I and life are two separate things. And so I can also lose my life, my imaginary treasured possession. Death becomes a seemingly reality and a threat. Words and concepts split life into separate segments that have no reality in themselves. We could even say that the notion, my life, is the original delusion of separateness, the source of ego. If I and life are two, if I am separate from life, then I am separated from all things, all beings, all people. But how could I be separate from life? What I could there be apart from life, apart from being? It is utterly impossible. So there's no such thing as my life, and I don't have a life. I am life. I and life are one. It cannot be otherwise. So how could I lose my life? How can I lose something that I don't have in the first place? How can I lose something that I am? It is impossible.